the more frequently someone watches porn, the less likely they are to feel close to their kids, and the less likely they are to talk about spiritual things with their family. If I'm in the shadows because of my porn addiction, guess what I'm not going to be talking to my son about? It's costing you much more than you think. It's costing your family much more than you think. And so don't be deceived, because the enemy wants us to think, oh man, this is just a private thing, and man, it's not hurting anybody if no one knows about it. I promise you, it's hurting you and those that are closest to you much more than you know.
This is what's on tap for today's episode, with a great guest to guide us through it. Let's go. This is the show dedicated to raising up the next generation of men of faith and character. My name is Mark Stanifer. Welcome to the Next Man Up,
part of the NRT Podcast Network.
Well, hey, gentlemen, welcome once again to the Next Man Up podcast and to the community that is changing the world, one boy becoming a man at a time. So good to have you with us as always, and it is once again my honor and my privilege to be your host for today's episode. We are coming back once again to the topic of pornography, and to help us get into this topic a little deeper, today's guest is Ted Shimer. Ted's the founder of the Freedom Fight, which is an online pornography addiction recovery program. He's mentored young adults for nearly 3 decades with his college ministry student mobilization. He's got a degree from Dallas Seminary. He's been trained as a pastoral sex addiction professional. And his discipleship background, his theological instruction, and his clinical training gives him a unique and grounded approach to addiction recovery that is biblically based, scientifically sound, and gospel-centered and effective. It was an honor to have some of Ted's time and to talk about this big and important topic that is often really challenging for us to talk about, especially when we as dads, we as men, are struggling with this ourselves. And so I really appreciate Ted's wisdom and his experience and his grace as he guides us into and through this topic for how really we can confront this issue that we struggle with as men, and as dads, how we can help our boys and our kids navigate well through this. So you know the topic, and you now know who our guest is, Ted Shimer of the Freedom Fight. So let's just get to it. Here we go. Well, Ted, thank you so much for giving this audience, this show, some of your precious time today. I appreciate you coming on. And although this topic is going to be heavy, and I wish we could have met maybe under different circumstances, I do appreciate your willingness to engage with this topic and to join our show today. So thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. It's a joy to be with you, and I just appreciate your desire to equip dads in helping their sons, because I can't think of a more crucial thing related to this topic in an area that, I think is really going to benefit dads a ton and their sons.
So as I mentioned to you just a minute ago, the topic of pornography is not a new topic for this audience. It's also not a new topic for guys in general, but I wanted to start the conversation with some statistics that you shared with me earlier, because I think it really frames up why is it that we're talking about this topic again. So in 2019, a Pornhub report, a self-published Pornhub report, said they had more than 42 billion total visits, 115 million daily visits, and 170 years of new content created. 1 in 5 mobile searches are for pornography. 88% of scenes in porn films contain acts of physical aggression. Listen to this one, dads. The average age of first exposure to porn for a child is between 8 and 11 years old. Children under 10 now account for 22% of online porn consumption of those 18 and under. Last stat, 47% of all families claim that pornography is an existing problem with someone in their home. Ted, this is like, is it too much of an extreme statement to say this is an epidemic? And like, where do we even begin to fight this thing?
Yeah, and it's those stats are sobering, and what's scary about that, Mark, is in 2020, Pornhub stats showed a significant jump during COVID. Their idea of serving humanity is they gave their top package for free for 30 days, and they saw even a bigger jump. And so we know the isolation, the stress, much more time online during COVID. These numbers have unfortunately only increased. And so it can be overwhelming, when we kind of drink all of that in. But it really should be motivating for us, particularly just understanding that typically the younger a person is, when we look at the stats, the more that their use increases. In the 18 to 22-year-old, their consumption of porn is typically much more than if somebody's in their 30s or 40s. And so that's, so as we talk about the impact of pornography, that's one of the trends that we're seeing. Man, it goes deeper. And for the dads out there, one of the scary elements is the adolescent brain is more susceptible to addictive substances. And so if somebody starts using, whether it's alcohol, tobacco, or drugs, or pornography, when they're an adolescent, the chances that it becomes a lifelong struggle go way up. And so, yeah, we definitely need to be sobered by those statistics, but also realize that, man, thanks to COVID, those statistics have only gone up in the last year and a half.
So I know you've got a long history in this space, in working here and ministering to men and not just men, I know as well. But I'm curious, Ted, what was it that drew you into this space to begin with? Because the battle is so big, the impact is so big. Like what was it that drew you into this fight specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. My wife and I, we've been on staff with a collegiate ministry for the last 30 years. Discipling college students, is really our calling. And so it was really in the mid 2000s that, 04, 05, 06, that we started seeing this steady uptick in the number of our student leaders that we were having to disqualify from leadership because they had a porn addiction. And Mark, it got so bad that in 07, as a ministry, we identified pornography as the biggest obstacle to us as a ministry fulfilling our mission of building spiritual leaders for Christ. And so we recognize we're either going to address this issue with real solutions, or we're not going to have leaders, or we're going to have to lower our standards for leaders. And so as a ministry, in 07, we started having all of our staff guys at the time go through a porn addiction recovery program so that we could be better equipped to help these young men break free from porn in the context of discipleship. So it's kind of ironic because that was in 2007 that we started taking some of these drastic measures. And it was in the second half of 2007 that the first iPhone came out.
That's right.
And so what we thought was, a horrible situation was about to get dramatically worse. But really since 2007, I've walked through and been through over 20 different porn addiction recovery programs or resources as I've walked with different staff or different students. I've been trained as a certified sex addiction therapist to get the clinical training. And really through that process, we've identified, hey, here are the key principles that lead to recovery and freedom. Because again, our calling to raise up spiritual leaders for Christ, this was the biggest issue. And, as a dad myself, just recognizing, particularly with my son, that, man, I need to know how to address this issue, with a boy in the house as well. And so, those were definitely some of the motivating factors that really, I think the Lord used to really compel me to dive deep into this topic.
Wow, little did you know that the challenge you were trying to solve for ministry viability would be a foundation for like a tsunami of problem that was to come with the onset and the digitalization of this stuff in our handheld devices. That's fascinating, man. It's so cool how, I don't want to overstate this, but it's cool how God was out in front of you guys at the time and was building the foundation for you to be able to help more than just the leadership development within your ministry.
Yeah, absolutely. And really, because when we created the Freedom Fight, which is our free program that was kind of, the fruition, of all this research and learning. And hey, we wanted to be good stewards and put it in a user-friendly format. And really, that's one of the reasons, as I started interacting with other churches and ministries and, sharing it, just realizing, hey, we want to be good stewards with what God, has shown us through this process, and realizing, hey, it's not just for us, but we want to share what God's taught us, in the last 15 years, just as, we've been, in the context of disciple making, as we've been helping people find freedom, in this area.
Ted, I wonder if you could just kind of frame the challenge that pornography creates for us with this idea of what's at stake. I started with some pretty sobering stats. We as guys know that we're visually attracted to females, and pornography gives us that visual stimulation and then some. But it could potentially be easy for us to dismiss the collateral damage, the collateral effects of this thing. So frame it for us. What's at stake here?
Yeah, that's a great question. We know it's pervasive. You read the stats, but pornography is also very destructive on multiple levels. It's interesting that in 1 Peter 2:11, it says, as aliens and strangers, abstain from fleshly lust, which wage war against the soul. That when God was describing how fleshly lust, like pornography, impacts a person, it says it wages war against the soul, the deepest part of who we are. He says in 1 Corinthians 6:18, flee from sexual immorality. All other sin that a person commits are outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against their own body. And that word in the Greek for immorality is porneia, in where we get our word porn. But God has put an asterisk by sexual sin, puts it in a different category to help us be sobered by it. But there's been a really incredible study, a 6-year study of 3,000 people done by a sociology professor at OU, Dr. Samuel Perry. It's been peer reviewed. And he was looking at the impact of pornography on a person in their relationships. And it's really fascinating. If either the husband or wife in a couple starts watching porn, that couple is 2 to 3 times more likely to divorce in the next 2 years than the porn-free couple. And when you think about the impact of divorce, obviously in a home, in churches, that's massive. But he also found that there was a correlation between the frequency of someone's porn use and the probability that they would serve in their church or their congregation. The more somebody watches porn, the less likely they are to serve and to be involved in some type of leadership. On the parenting front, it's really crazy that the more frequently someone watches porn, the less likely they are to feel close to their kids, and the less likely they are to talk about spiritual things with their family. And so when you think of this topic in the context of spiritual warfare, which is where God puts it when he says it wages war against our soul, I mean, the enemy is having a field day with using pornography to destroy marriages, to bring distance and isolation between a dad, usually, and his family, making dads taking less leadership. They're, have a less, close relationship with their kids. They're speaking less about spiritual things with their kids because the enemy uses shame in the life of a Christian, man, to keep them in the shadows. Like I could never share with somebody, about this struggle. And the enemy uses that to keep them in the shadows and isolate them. And it's costing men and their families and their marriages much more than they think. Because, when there's a lot of shame, our hearts deceive ourselves. We go into denying, minimizing, and rationalizing this area of our life. And man, the enemy uses that just to keep us in the shadows. And so it's having a massive impact in marriages, in churches, and on the family, at a really significant level. But those are some of the specifics.
So what I'm hearing you say is it's really fostering disconnection. And disconnection with those relationships in the home or in the spiritual community, where we are so wired to want and need that connection. This porn addiction is getting in the way of that, and it's creating disconnection. The other thing that I heard you say that I would like you to unpack just a little bit. We've talked about it here on the show, but I think it's worth talking about again, especially for the new listener that maybe hears this for the first time. Distinguish between shame and guilt, because I think we can often believe or feel that they are the same thing, but they're radically different.
The message of guilt is, I've done bad. Okay, I need to repent. So that's important. Shame is different because shame says, I am bad. There's a sense of worthlessness and self-hatred at the core of shame. And, in one of the studies that we did with college students, Christian college students, Christians who are growing, plugged into a campus ministry, 90% of those who engage in watching porn, which for the guys, it was 89% of this group of growing Christian men. Nine out of 10 of them said they experienced self-hatred immediately afterwards. And so it's a very powerful thing, because when a person regularly experiences self-hatred, their ability to believe and receive the love of God is much more difficult. Maybe they can understand it in their head, but to truly believe it and receive it when they regularly are feeling self-hatred, and that self-hatred keeps people in the shadows. But man, I could never share this with somebody, because if somebody knew this, they're going to reject me. And that's what shame is, this rejection, this fear of rejection. And that's what causes this isolation. I'm not going to really share who I am, because I already hate myself in certain areas, and man, I've got to kind of cover that up, and I've got to kind of put this facade on. And so shame is one of those spiritual attacks that, keeps people disconnected from God. Hey, I could never, people say, oh, it's like, hey, after I use porn, I don't even want to look at my Bible on my nightstand, because, man, I just feel unworthy. And, hey, I'm not going to pray, just all these, really demonic messages, these lies that the enemy tells us. And man, shame is, one of those messages that, man, is regularly delivered through pornography.
So for the half of the human species that already struggles with connecting and admitting struggles and asking for help and being transparent and vulnerable with other guys, you throw this porn element into the mix, and it just makes it that much harder for guys to reach out and move past that shame, right? At least that's what I'm hearing.
Well, and that's so critical, because the first step, and if any of your listeners are struggling, with porn, which the stats would tell us that many are, that first step to freedom, James 5:16 says, therefore confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The first step toward healing is stepping out of the shadows, is that confession piece. Quick story, I think that illustrates, how powerful shame is in this area. A pastor in the Houston area who's been utilizing our program in his church, he was like, man, we have this group of 10 guys meeting regularly in an accountability group. They're in their 20s. There's guys in their 20s and 30s. And they met, they kind of prided themselves on getting below the surface, that, hey, we're dealing with the big issues. And after over a year, the first guy finally admitted that he was addicted to porn. And slowly, over the next few weeks, all 10 of them admitted that they were addicted to porn. But they had been meeting for over a year in this accountability group that was like, hey, we're getting below the surface.
That's right.
I was telling a guy that the other day, and he's like, man, I know guys that kept that secret from their best friends for 15 or 20 years. It's just like, man, the enemy, is doing a number, because when we stay in the shadows, man, that's where the enemy does a number on our family, on our marriage, with our kids. We've got to bring it into the light. The sooner we bring it into the light and confess it, man, that's when we get to see God start working and bringing healing to the process.
So let me keep you going there, because I know that it's a challenge often for guys to nurture and develop deep friendships. Unless they've been in the foxholes together or on that competitive team together, or they've done life together for years and years and years, it's hard to foster and nurture those relationships. So with that kind of as a backdrop, and the whole embarrassment and shame in as well, when you suggest a guy goes into that first step of confessing, who does he turn to? Like, what's the best? And I know this is a big question, and it's probably nuanced and contextualized to each guy, but what's the best outlet for that confession to just to get the ball rolling towards some sense of healing?
We talk about the need for a trusted friend, a mentor, a spiritual leader, so someone you can trust, someone you have a relationship with. It could, your first confession could be, hey, to your spiritual leaders, hey, I know I can trust this guy. And so each guy can be different. Sometimes, confessing to a guy they don't know as well can be an easier first step. One of the things that we've done, our Freedom Fight program is a 6-month program that, for small groups and individuals with accountability partners to go through. But we created a 30-day challenge, which is, like it sounds, it's 30 days, 10 minutes or less of, content each day. But one of the reasons we created that was to make those conversations easier. Just like, hey, man, I'm going through this purity, program. Hey, why don't you join me? And it provides just the opportunity, to discuss on this topic. And so those, I think, having some of those outlets, and I would tell a guy, man, if you don't know who to confess to, start making that something you pray daily about. And I'm confident God will answer that prayer. Because God wants to see you walking in the light. So start praying for courage. Maybe you're like, dude, I could never do that. Hey, start asking God for courage. Start asking him for that person. And you can be confident because God loves to answer that prayer, bring his children out of the darkness into the light. And I will say this, I mentioned earlier, man, it costs men more than they know. And one of the ways it costs them is having these conversations with their sons. Because if I'm in the shadows because of my porn addiction, guess what I'm not going to be talking to my son about?
That's right.
And that's a huge barrier. There's, I told this story in my book, that a youth pastor at our church, talked to the kids about porn. And one of the kids came to him and said, man, I'm really struggling with this. And, I need help. 7th grader. And this, youth pastor was like, well, hey, let me talk to your dad to get him involved. And man, would you mind if I do that? And the kid was like, yes, I would love that. And so the youth pastor talks to the dad, like, man, your son is struggling with this. He really wants, to talk to you about it. He said that, I could tell you about it. And so, this youth pastor followed up 3 months later, and guess what? The dad still did not have the conversation with his son. What is that? And the reason he didn't, because he himself was struggling. But it's just like, what does that communicate to that son? And so this is a critical conversation for dads to have. And yet, we think, well, hey, this is something I'm doing in private. My wife doesn't know about it. My kids don't know, it's costing you much more than you think. It's costing your family much more than you think. And so don't be deceived, because the enemy wants us to think, oh man, this is just a private thing. And man, it's not hurting anybody if no one knows about it. I promise you, it's hurting you and those that are closest to you much more than you know.
Well, if you are hearing these words right now, that means you stayed with us through this conversation with Ted around this big and pervasive topic of pornography. So let me thank you. Thank you for staying engaged. Thank you for listening to what Ted has to say. Thank you for your courage to stay with this topic. And I don't know where you are in this battle as a man. I don't know where you are in this battle as a father. I don't know how pornography has touched you or your family. But thank you for not turning this episode off, for listening all the way to this point, and for engaging in this big and important topic. The stats are depressing. The information can be discouraging. Our own battles with not just guilt, but the battle with shame can be discouraging. And yet, let me encourage you to stay with it as a man and as a father, because the fight matters. The battle is worth it. And our sons, our families, our spiritual communities are counting on us. I also want to invite you back to the second half of our conversation to hear how this conversation resolves the recovery process and resources that Ted and the Freedom Fight make available to you and to others, and just an encouragement to stay in this fight because it matters. So won't you join us once again for the conclusion of this conversation with Ted Shimer? You know the drill. Same bat time, same bat channel, guys, next week. Until then, adios. Hey, listeners, thanks for journeying with us on this Next Man Up podcast. We would love to hear from you. Maybe you have a question or an idea, perhaps a topic for us to consider. If that's you and you want to reach out to us, you can get us at feedback@thenextmanup.com. That's feedback@thenextmanup.com. Again, we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, we'll see you later.